Thank you all for coming today. My name is Mitch Parsons, and I'm going to be presenting some work looking at how foraging mode affects the behavior of captive coyotes. And this is a project that I completed along with my co-authors Andrew Garcia and Julie Young at the USDA National Wildlife Research Center. When we think of predators, we typically imagine them pursuing and hunting live prey in order to acquire their food. But in reality, predators can also acquire food via scavenging of natural prey resources or using anthropogenic foods and non-natural resources. And in different situations, predators may be benefited by different behavioral traits and personalities that improve their ability to acquire resources in different ways. And so it's possible that there's a link between foraging mode and behavior that we don't really understand that well. Additionally, with the increasing human influence worldwide, we're seeing the emergence of predators without prey, predators that are increasingly relying on these non-prey resources as their main source of food. A great example is hyenas in East Africa, which almost exclusively rely on provisioned food as well as the remains of domestic livestock. Aside from these examples, there's also growing examples of predators using non-prey resources such as landfills, human trash, pet food that's left out, just a diversity of resources that predators can use that don't require active pursuit. And we don't really know what this means for carnivore and predator behavior. And so that was what we were trying to address with this research project. And to get at this a little bit, we conducted a study on captive coyotes. We conducted the study at the Millville Predator Research Center, which houses about 100 captive coyotes, typically housed in pairs. And typically these coyotes are fed 6 days a week with an animal care staff walking in, scattering food about the pen, wherein the coyotes can run around and pick it up. What we did was we introduced a prey model that coyotes had to pursue in order to acquire their food to a subset of these coyotes, and looked at subsequent behavioral changes. You can see that prey model here in the top right of this slide. Essentially, we took an RC car, we dressed it up in rabbit fur and put a small head-like object on it. We would put the food on top of the car, and the coyotes would have to pursue it and either catch it or knock it over in order to acquire their food. We ran this study from November 2019 to November 2020 with 8 pairs of coyotes. We had 4 non-hunting pairs, and these coyotes were also introduced to the prey model, but it was non-mobile, and so that was the control for this new object. Additionally, we had our 4 hunting pairs of coyotes, which were scatter-fed 3 days per week and fed from the prey model 3 days per week. Throughout the study period, we conducted monthly focal observations during both feeding and non-feeding times, and every 3 months we introduced the same multi-axis puzzle box and a novel object to see how willing coyotes were to interact with the novel object and potentially solve the puzzle box. Getting right into our results and starting with the focal observations, this plot here shows the proportion of time that coyotes spent resting on the y-axis throughout the study period on the x-axis. And this data is for the non-feeding focal observations. We can see that our hunting coyotes, displayed as the red triangles, increased the proportion of time that they spent resting throughout the study period, whereas our non-hunting coyotes were relatively constant throughout the study period. And of course, this proportion of time has to come from somewhere, and what we saw simultaneously to this was that our coyotes spent less time active. Specifically, our hunting coyotes decreased the proportion of time that they spent stereotyping. So again, this plot shows the proportion of time stereotyping on the y-axis throughout the study period. And you can see that our hunting coyotes, again in red, spent a little bit of time stereotyping at the beginning of the project, but that decreased to near 0 by the end of the project. Moving on to the results from our puzzle box, unfortunately we only had a single coyote that successfully solved the puzzle box, so we weren't able to use it as a measure of innovation. But what we were able to do is look at exploration and willingness to interact with this object that could provide a food reward. This plot here shows the proportion of time that coyotes spent within 1 meter on the y-axis throughout the study period. Again, hunters in red, non-hunters in blue, and you can can see that both groups increased the proportion of time that they spent within 1 meter of the puzzle box, but that increase was larger for our hunting coyotes. Continuing with the puzzle box, here we're looking at the latency to coyotes interacting with the puzzle box on the y-axis. And you can see that remained about constant for the non-hunting coyotes, but that our hunting coyotes decreased their time to interaction. So throughout the study, they were quicker to interact with the puzzle box. Looking at the results of our novel object test, here we're looking at the latency to approach within 5 meters. And throughout the study period, neither group of coyotes showed much interest or willingness to approach the novel object. You can see that there's not really any temporal trends and that there's no real differences between either group in this case. So in this project, we saw a few main results that came out of our study. We saw that our hunting coyotes increased the proportion of time that they spent resting throughout the study period. This could be because they're having to exert a little bit more energy to acquire their food, having to pursue this car around, but it could also be related to increased enrichment and stimulation by having to interact with this car to acquire food. And that result may be supported by the decrease that we saw in stereotyping behavior by our hunting coyotes. Additionally, we saw that increased exploration around the puzzle box by our hunting coyotes, suggesting that they were more willing and became more willing through time to explore and interact with this object that could have a food reward associated with it. Unfortunately, we were limited by a lack of participation. Like I said, only one coyote solved the puzzle box, and really only 2 coyotes regularly and enthusiastically interacted with the prey model. Additionally, the change that we introduced was kind of the opposite of what you would expect in wild carnivores. We were taking scavenging coyotes and trying to introduce hunting, whereas if in the wild we would expect to see wild carnivores switching from using live prey to scavenging. However, we did still see some behavioral changes associated with this treatment, which does suggest that there could be this link between foraging and behavior. With that, I would just like to thank the staff, volunteers, and interns at the Predator Research Facility that made this project possible. I would like to thank the USDA National Wildlife Research Center for the funding that they provided. And I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to watch my presentation.